Let's just dive right into this explainer because we are looking at a massive historical paradigm shift today. We're going to explore the true origins of early Islamic scholars, relying on some absolutely incredible research by the master historian Dr. Bashar Awad Maroof.
Now here's a widely accepted assumption that honestly, even modern scholars just take for granted without a second thought. If you were to ask most people today, hey, who are the foundational Islamic scholars? You know, the great jurists, the Hadith compilers, the linguists, they'd probably tell you they came from outside the Arabian Peninsula, that they were mostly non-Arabs. It's one of those facts repeated so often it just feels like common knowledge, right?
But where did this idea actually come from in the first place? Well, we really have to look back at one of the most famous thinkers in history, Ibn Khaldun. We're starting with his immense authority here, specifically a famous quote in his Prolegomena, or Muqaddimah. He essentially popularized this idea that non-Arabs carried the Islamic sciences. And look, Ibn Khaldun is an absolute giant of sociology and history. When he wrote that the bearers of knowledge were mostly non-Arabs from places like Iraq and Khorasan, people listened. His word basically became the baseline for centuries of historical understanding.
So here is where it gets super interesting. Master historian Dr. Bashar completely pulls the rug out from under this claim. He reveals a totally different perspective. He points out that, yes, while Ibn Khaldun was a genius, absolutely, he had some critical blind spots when it came to the Eastern Islamic world. You see, Ibn Khaldun lived primarily in North Africa and Egypt. His knowledge of the deep history of places like Iraq and Khorasan, it was actually kind of limited. He was heavily relying on summarized, sometimes flawed, secondary copies of older texts. He simply didn't grasp the complex demographic shifts that had already happened in the East.
To put that into perspective, consider the sheer scale of the Arab demographic shift that Ibn Khaldun missed. 50,000 Arab families migrated to the region of Khorasan alone during the early Islamic conquests. I mean, really think about that number for a second. If your average family has a husband, a wife, and maybe 2 or 3 kids, you're looking at 250,000 Arabs settling deep into the East. That's a massive influx. They didn't just conquer and leave. They took their families, they put down roots, and they built entire communities in these new lands.
And this massive migration naturally leads us to what we can call the name-game confusion. Initially, under early Islamic rule, Arab warriors received these stipends based strictly on their tribal affiliations. But jump ahead to the Abbasid era, and this tribal stipend system was abolished. Suddenly, clinging to your ancient tribal name wasn't financially necessary anymore. So Arab settlers who had been living in these eastern cities for generations, they just adopted geographic surnames. For example, a scholar with pure Arab lineage living in Nishapur simply became known as Al-Naisaburi. Someone in Isfahan became Al-Isfahani. These geographic names completely masked their deep Arab tribal roots.
Okay, it's also really essential to understand the concept of wala. Even when scholars actually were of non-Arab descent, the culture was just incredibly deeply intertwined. Through this system of wala, non-Arabs would officially integrate into Arab tribes as clients. They adopted the tribal loyalties, the cultural norms, and crucially, an intense pride in the Arabic language. This cultural blending really cemented an overriding Arabic tribal identity among the scholarly class, basically regardless of their original ethnic starting point.
This next part is absolutely fascinating, because when you actually dig into the lineages, you find that scholars everyone assumes are non-Arab actually possess distinct Arab tribal roots. Take Imam Muslim, famously from Nishapur. His lineage traces right back to the Arab Kushairi tribe. Abu Dawood, from the Azdi tribe. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, often associated with the East, was purely from the Arab Shaybani tribe. And even Imam Bukhari, from Bukhara, was officially affiliated with the Arab Jufi tribe through that very wala system we just talked about. Their geographic surnames completely threw casual historians off the scent.
To further prove this cultural dominance, Dr. Bashar went digging and found over 80 schools in pre-Safavid Iran that taught exclusively in the Arabic language. And he didn't just look at the major hubs, he mapped out all these tiny villages and towns too. In all his rigorous research, he couldn't find a single school that taught in anything other than Arabic during that era. Not one. The lectures, the textbooks, the scholarly debates, the whole shebang was an entirely Arabic-speaking intellectual ecosystem, and that was driven by the fact that Arabic was literally the undeniable language of the religion.
Even scholars of verifiable non-Arab origin fiercely defended Arabic. Look at this incredibly powerful quote from the great polymath Al-Biruni. He viewed the Arabic language not just as some basic tool for communication, but as the unbreakable emblem of the Islamic faith and civilization itself. The scholars of the time, whether ethnically Arab or not, were culturally and linguistically totally immersed in an Arabic Islamic identity. To them, the religion and the Arabic language were inseparable twins.
So you might be wondering, how exactly do we know all this hard data? It's really easy to make grand historical claims today when we have digital databases literally at our fingertips. But what kind of gritty, exhaustive detective work does it actually take for someone like Dr. Bashar to rewrite history and correct a giant like Ibn Khaldun? Well, the answer lies in a level of academic dedication that is honestly almost unimaginable to us today.
167. That is the jaw-dropping number of unique, handwritten manuscripts Dr. Bashar meticulously verified for his master's thesis alone. He wasn't just sitting around reading printed books. He was tracking down original, scattered, ancient manuscripts. His thesis ultimately spanned over 2,000 pages across 8 volumes. He had to painstakingly cross-reference every single biographical entry just to trace the true tribal lineages and geographic movements of these early scholars.
His unbelievable dedication to uncovering the truth meant traveling across countries way before the internet even existed. I mean, he went to Alexandria and physically hand-copied decaying manuscripts because, well, there were no photocopying machines available. He then traveled to Cairo and lived there for half a year on a meager 50 Egyptian pounds. He would stand outside the library doors before they opened, stay until the absolute final closing bell rang, and survive on cheap food, just entirely consumed by this mission of extracting absolute historical truth.
Now, applying this exact same rigorous, source-critical, historical methodology, Dr. Bashar turns his attention to the narrative of the Mahdi. He basically contrasts what he calls a waiting ideology with an active ideology. By examining the historical texts completely impartially, Dr. Bashar explains how the Mahdi concept has historically functioned as a passive ideology. It's a belief system where society kind of just waits around for a magical savior to fix injustice rather than taking active responsibility themselves to build civilization and fight corruption.
He points out some glaring historical red flags using the exact same critical lens he used on Ibn Khaldun. Most notably, he highlights the total absence of any mention of the Mahdi in the 2 most rigorous and strict Hadith compilations we have, Bukhari and Muslim. Dr. Bashar traces the origins of the narrative back to figures like Ka'b al-Akhbar, showing its deep connections to older pre-Islamic Judeo-Christian savior myths. Furthermore, he explains how, historically, this narrative was repeatedly hijacked by political imposters to stir up chaos, or conversely, to justify societal passivity in the face of very real-world problems like colonialism.
Finally, all of this leaves us with a really provocative thought that challenges everything we think we know about history. Whether we're looking at the ethnic origins of history's greatest scholars or deeply ingrained societal narratives, Dr. Bashar's work proves that popular consensus is not necessarily the same thing as historical truth. It really urges us to deeply question the myths that shape our world. So what other facts have you accepted simply because everyone else repeats them? Keep questioning, keep learning, and hey, don't ever be afraid to look at the original sources for yourself.